London, the support at the beginning of the seizure of power of al-Noor in a way did appear to give the military a form of religious legitimacy, certainly. How important is it to this process of transition for this particular group to stay within the process and continue to back the military and those forces that are opposed to President Morsi?
Well, the problem with that is that the idea of legitimacy, that depends on who is analysing the situation. So for some people, notably Muslim Brotherhood supporters, the inclusion of al-Noor within the transitional opposition alliance might seem like a bit of a cynical attempt to try and make it appear as though there is some kind of inclusion for Islamist parties, or at least the right kind of Islamist parties. And let's remember that al-Noor party was, of course, quite closely affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood not that long ago, when they were both trying to force through a very unpopular and divisive constitution through Parliament. So for the al-Noor party, it does look a bit like a kind of opportunistic attempt to take support that it believes is hemorrhaging away from the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, for supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, this is not going to do anything to persuade them that the democratic process hasn't now been hijacked by military intervention.
Well, Tamer El-Meehy, I just want to pick up on that point of the role of the al-Noor party. Are they being politically cynical, for example, to side with the transition process in the first place, now suddenly to suspend their participation, at the same time as having been a critical partner in terms of forming a majority in Parliament together with the Freedom and Justice Party? They appear to be flipping and flopping according to what they define as their political needs.
Basically, what I think is that June 30th demonstrated that all religious-based parties are in crisis. This is not just simply a crisis for the Freedom and Justice Party. It's a crisis for the project of political Islam, and it's not just in Egypt. It will spread all over the region, and definitely, this is why we're seeing al-Noor party, as you mentioned, flipping and flopping around, hesitating in its positions, not taking a really divisive measure or choosing sides. And in certain revolutionary situations, like the ones we're witnessing these days, you have to take sides. At one point, you have to make a choice. You can't continue indefinitely trying to hold the stick from the middle. We've seen before, over the last couple of years, how many what they call centrist political Islam parties try to play this role. And it didn't work out. It didn't work out for Abdel Menam Abu Futuh, for instance. It didn't work out for Al-Wasat, who would have suffered tremendously, except for the support that the Muslim Brotherhood provided to them. And I believe the Noor party is going to suffer as well. What we're seeing is that day after day, the influence and the popularity of the Islamic project is waning. Unless al-Noor does something about it, its legitimacy, its popularity, its base among the people is going to decline as well.
Well, Rachel Shabi, though, the participation of al-Noor within the coalition, the military-led, if you want to put it that way, coalition, played a very important role in that it made the appearance that this was not a situation of Islamists against secular parties, that it was a matter of political power, of poor governance. It was not a question, as many Muslim Brotherhood supporters are insisting at the present, that it is a crackdown by a secular government on Islamist believers. How important was the fact that al-Noor prevented this argument from actually getting traction?
Well, I don't think they did prevent that argument from getting traction. That's the trouble, that the situation still looks very much like a crackdown on Islamists just for the very fact of being Islamist. And to be clear, the massive and unprecedented opposition to Mohamed Morsi as president that erupted onto the streets of Egypt has been a long time coming, and it has been building over the year of his presidency, which was seen as a disaster. It was divisive, it was polarizing, it was unpopular, it was had sectarian tinges that many people found troubling, it was power-grabbing, and it was authoritarian. So it's no surprise to see people out on the streets opposing this presidency, and it's no surprise to see that the Muslim Brotherhood hemorrhaged away so much of their support in the space of just 1 year. However, because of the way the situation panned out, because what happened was that the army effectively stepped in and executed a military takeover, and clearly it is still in power. This is not a transitional civilian government that is in power at the moment. The military is still calling the shots. So because it happened in that way, and because there has been such a crackdown, a shutdown of Islamist channels, a roundup of Muslim Brotherhood leaders, and the attacks and killings of Muslim Brotherhood supporters that we've seen in the last few days, that is of course going to make the Muslim Brotherhood feel that this is a secular attack, regardless of what the intentions may be.
Well, let's just pause at this moment and take a look at the wider context. The Al-Nur party's decision is just the latest example of how fluid and fractious Egyptian politics has become. Let's try and trace some of these political alliances, starting with the 2011 parliamentary elections. Religious parties were able to form a government after winning 70% of the vote. They included the two big players, the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party and the Salafi Al-Nur Party. Then on to presidential elections that were held just over a year ago. And with the support garnered during the previous election, Mohamed Morsi wins, but with a slim majority. A former Air Force General, Ahmad Shafiq, takes the remainder of the votes. Now, flash forward to last Wednesday, Mohamed Morsi is deposed in a military coup, which crucially had the backing of his former allies, the Al-Nur Party. And here's where we are today, with Egypt divided between those who support and oppose the military coup. On the one side, a number of groups that include the Tamarad or rebellion movement. On the other, the Muslim Brotherhood, whose supporters are staging nationwide protests. And somewhere in the middle is the Al-Nur Party, which has suspended its negotiations with the military. But Al-Nur is a new factor in Egyptian politics to a certain extent. But what is not new is what we've been talking about, Tamer El-Meehy, the crackdown by the military on what it sees as a Islamist movement, the Muslim Brotherhood. This type of crackdown was seen in the Mubarak years. And it does appear, when one looks at this, that it's not a question of what's happened to the revolution, but whether there was a revolution at all when you see the same images of what happened in past decades. Your view on that?
First of all, I'm not so sure it's a coup. I'm not so sure that it's entirely a coup. Maybe technically, yes, the military sided with the wishes of the people at a certain point in time. But with all these millions pouring down the streets for days, almost a week now, you've seen the demonstrations yesterday. You've seen what happened on the 30th, and before then. And it's not limited to Cairo. So you can't simply call it a Cairene or a Cairo-based phenomenon. It's all over the nation. So I'm not so sure, really, this is a coup. I think calling it a coup is rather simplistic.
That point indeed is taken, Tamer El-Meehy. But if I could just put that question to you, as a member of the National Salvation Front, there has been a degree of silence on the actions that have been taken against members of a movement, imprisonment, a detention on a number of occasions. And it does appear that whether or not one agreed with the government that was in place, a Freedom and Justice-led government, surely a group like the National Salvation Front should be loud in its objection to a military crackdown on a political movement.
Definitely, definitely, and this has been clear right from the start. Our first our very first announcement that we made through our party outlined 5 important points. That while we do welcome having the military side with the wish of the people to introduce change, and that we appreciate that this actually prevented the eruption of wide-scale violence and bloodshed, we were very clear that we wanted this transitional period to be as short as possible. We support this insofar as there is a clear roadmap towards building a democracy. We opposed any extra-legal or any measures to be taken outside the frame of the law against any member of any political party whatsoever. We were totally against violence, whether it was initiated by the Islamists or by the organs of the state. And up till today, we're still holding this position. We're calling for an independent investigation in all incidents of violence, and that the law should take its course, regardless of who the perpetrator is.
Well, those points are well taken, Tamer El-Meehy, but I want to speak to Rachel Shabi on the same issue. You mentioned earlier that the crackdown that has happened, but in particular, you've seen a really strong crackdown on the media. The various channels that support the Muslim Brotherhood have been shut down. But it's not only those supporters. We've had widespread actions against the media, including colleagues from Al Jazeera and other media organizations from various factions within Egypt, including the transitional governance of the country. To what extent does this undercut the whole justification for the process of what has happened in the past week and threaten any possibility of a restoration of a true democracy in the weeks and months and years to come?
Well, it makes the idea that this is a civilian coup look slightly naive, if not outright preposterous. I mean, let's be clear about the army in Egypt. It has its own interests at heart all the time. The opposition knows this. The Muslim Brotherhood knows this. The army is a significant player in Egypt. It has key strategic interests. It is responsible for foreign policy. It has managed to keep its interests intact through the constitution that President Morsi rushed through Parliament. And of course, it has huge economic assets in Egypt, which is very keen to protect. Now, the idea that the army will now suddenly start to act in the best interests of the people, when clearly it hasn't from the moment that the revolution began. When the military council were ruling Egypt for those 15 months before the first democratic elections, protesters were on the streets to oppose that very military rule that they're now cheering now. So the idea that the opposition feels that it could write a 5-point plan that asks the military to behave in a certain way and expect the military to pay heed to any of that, I just find that dangerously naive.
Well, let's go straight to Tamer El-Meehy on that. You were one of those who was in the streets protesting against the military 15 months ago when it appeared to be determined to hold on to power.
Definitely, and I would like to reply to that. If the military is moving entirely out of its own self-interest, what was the threat to this self-interest from its partnership with the Muslim Brotherhood? Nothing. They got what they wanted in the constitution. There was no threat to their economic empire. There was no threat to their interests. They were free to manage their affairs as they pleased. So to simply say that they moved out of their own self-interest is a bit simplistic, I'm afraid to say. I'm afraid to say there is a larger picture that the military is involved in. I definitely agree that the military plays a very important role in the stability of the political system in Egypt. And possibly one of the reasons for the military to make this move is that it felt that the stability of the current political system is threatened by the new rulers, by the new regime, that it's no longer capable of maintaining the stability of the system. This society was a society in danger. And the military, I think, moved out of its concern for the general welfare and the general stability of the state. This is not to naively say that the military does not have its own self-interest. Definitely the military has its own self-interest, and these self-interests were going to be safeguarded regardless who's in power. Okay, this is an important thing. The second thing is that since the fall of Mubarak, till the military handed over power to the Muslim Brotherhood, the experience has been really horrific for the army. They found themselves at odds with their own people. They found themselves severely criticized and attacked by their own people. And it's highly unlikely that they're going to repeat the same mistakes again. It's better for them to preserve their self-interest through having a civilian government that's capable of ruling. What the Muslim Brotherhood promised, okay, was that this stability, they're going to bring about this stability. They'll be able to manage the affairs of the country. And after a year, obviously, this was not the case.
Well, if I may just go to Rachel Shabi at that point, Tamer, if I may. And that is that regardless of the strength of many of those points, we do have a situation emerging where if you don't like the government that you voted for in an election, then you get the military in to remove that government. And in so doing as well, you then clamp down on the media, so you have less media protests, you have less criticism of what happens. Is this the danger of what one is looking at in this process of seeking stability?
Well, that's exactly the danger. And, of course, the painful irony of this situation is that, you know, the army said it stepped in to prevent exactly the sort of bloodshed that we've just witnessed. I mean, there is more instability now than there was before the military takeover. And, of course, this is what happens, that you end up on this inevitable trajectory when it is a military takeover in that way, and you have a large and significant political player like the Muslim Brotherhood feeling so aggrieved. Now, whether you think that's justifiable or not, that is the reality. And, of course, they're not going to back down. So you have what's becoming an increasingly bloody and dangerous showdown between the army and the Muslim Brotherhood. And, you know, all along the opposition, one of its main complaints, rightly, with President Morsi was that he had a very majoritarian style of ruling, that his approach was, well, we're the majority, what we say goes, if you don't like it, well, you know, there's an election in 3 years. And now what we're seeing is the opposition employ the very same mindset of saying to the Muslim Brotherhood, well, the majority on the street has spoken against you, if you don't like it, you can shut up and we're going to shut you down.
Well, let's put that point to
the situation that's developed now.
If we may, Rachel, that issue of creating a coalition, of creating a form of dialogue, of involving Islamist groups like Al-Nur, Islamist groups like Freedom and Justice Party, the groups within the National Salvation Front. Is there a way forward out of this? Is there a way to get this dialogue without having the military as some kind of arbiter controlling the process? Is there any possibility left that the people of Egypt can create their own forum of dialogue without the soldiers and the generals telling them how to?
Definitely, I believe so. Just a couple of hours ago, I think, Sheikh Al-Azhar issued a statement urging all parties to start this process. He urged the presidency to form a reconciliation committee to start this dialogue. In our party and in the National Salvation Front, we're considering means through which we can start this dialogue. But I want to go back to a very important issue. When we're analyzing what's happening in the Egyptian scene, you can't just boil things down to a dichotomy of the military versus the Muslim Brotherhood. You had millions, you had more than 20 million people going down the street. These are not military personnel. These are people who have aspirations and who have demands. And if the military did not intervene, the scale of violence would have been really uncontrollable. If you've seen what's been happening in other Egyptian governorates over the last 48 hours only, the scale of violence is really scary and frightening. Unless this violence is contained in the immediate future, things would go out of hand. That's one thing. The other thing is that as far as June 30th is concerned, as a second wave of the revolution, that's how we prefer to look at it really, rather than simply a military coup. Because otherwise, it's the same thing that was done with Mubarak. Mubarak was ousted by the army. You can easily boil the revolution of the 25th of January to being a military coup. Anything can be a military coup once an officer in charge steps on the stage. Things are not that simple.
Well, they are not that simple, and I have to interrupt you there, Tamer El-Meehy. I think that your point was well made. Well, thank you so much to our guests, Tamer El-Meehy and Rachel Shabi. And thank you very much for joining us.